June 6, 1944. D-Day is celebrated as history's ultimate Allied triumph, but across the beaches of Normandy, thousands of German soldiers faced an apocalyptic onslaught. What actually happened to the men inside those concrete bunkers when the lines collapsed? From brutal close-quarters combat to the chaotic, often merciless moments of surrender, this is the dark, unfiltered reality of what the Allies did to them. To understand what the Allies did to the German defenders on D-Day, you first have to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. For the German soldiers stationed in the coastal bunkers, known as Widerstandsnests, or resistance nests, the morning of June 6th did not begin with the sight of infantry. It began with the complete and total weaponization of the horizon. Before a single Ally soldier set foot on the sand, the Allied naval armada unleashed a bombardment of incomprehensible scale. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of high-explosive shells directly into the German positions. For the men inside the concrete pillboxes, the experience was psychologically shattering. 14-inch naval shells didn't just explode, they altered the air pressure. The concussive force alone was enough to rupture eardrums, shatter capillaries, and drive men to the brink of madness. The Allies were not attempting a surgical strike. The objective was obliteration. But despite the sheer terror of the bombardment, at sectors like Omaha Beach, the naval guns and heavy bombers actually overshot their targets. When the smoke cleared, the concrete bunkers were terrifyingly intact. The Allies were not going to be able to destroy the Atlantic Wall from afar. They were going to have to dismantle it by hand. When the naval guns finally lifted their fire and the Allied landing craft dropped their ramps, the nature of the violence shifted. It transformed from an impersonal mechanized bombardment into something deeply intimate and unspeakably brutal. The Allies had to physically dismantle the Atlantic Wall, and that meant killing or capturing the men inside it. The German defensive positions were brilliantly engineered. They featured interlocking fields of machine gun fire, blind corners, and heavy concrete roofs that made them virtually immune to standard infantry weapons. To crack them open, Allied soldiers had to get incredibly close, and the tools they used to do it were designed for absolute devastation. As American, British, and Canadian troops pushed off the blood-soaked beaches, they engaged in a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The primary method the Allies used to neutralize German bunkers was not a polite request for surrender. It was high explosives and liquid fire. When an Allied squad managed to navigate through the hail of machine gun fire and reach the blind spot of a German bunker, they deployed weapons engineered for enclosed spaces. One of the most common was the satchel charge, a canvas bag packed with C2 explosive. Allied soldiers would arm the fuse, sprint to the bunker's firing slit, and shove the explosive inside. The resulting detonation in a confined concrete room was catastrophic. The overpressure would instantly kill anyone inside, turning the bunker from a fortress into a tomb. But an even more terrifying weapon was the M2 flamethrower. Carried primarily by American engineers, the flamethrower was the ultimate bunker-clearing tool. It fired a stream of thickened, burning fuel that stuck to whatever it hit, burning at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When an Allied soldier directed a flamethrower into a pillbox aperture, the results were horrific. Even if the liquid fire did not directly touch the German soldiers inside, the weapon was lethal. The intense combustion of the flamethrower instantaneously consumed the oxygen within the enclosed space of the bunker. The defenders were either incinerated, asphyxiated, or forced to flee the bunker entirely, often directly into the waiting crosshairs of Allied riflemen. White phosphorus grenades were also heavily utilized. When tossed down the ventilation shafts of German positions, these grenades exploded into a cloud of burning chemical fragments that ignited upon contact with oxygen. It was a suffocating, blinding inferno. The Allies did not fight a clean war on the beaches of Normandy. They fought a war of extermination against the defensive line, utilizing the most violent tools available to carve a path inland. But as the bunkers fell and the German lines began to fracture, a new, highly volatile dynamic emerged: the act of surrender. In the movies, surrender is often portrayed as a clean break in the action. A soldier drops his weapon, puts his hands up, and is safely escorted to the rear. The reality on D-Day was far more chaotic and often far more merciless. In the first few hours of the invasion, particularly on Omaha and Juno beaches, the concept of taking prisoners was almost a logistical impossibility. Allied soldiers were pinned down, fighting for their absolute survival in a meat grinder of artillery and machine gun fire. Imagine the psychological state of an Allied infantryman at 8 AM on Omaha Beach. He has just spent the last 2 hours watching his friends drown in the surf, be torn apart by shrapnel, or be cut down in half by MG-42 fire. His adrenaline is heavily spiking. He is terrified, exhausted, and consumed by rage. Suddenly, the German machine gunner who has been pouring lead into his platoon for the last hour runs out of ammunition, stands up, and raises his hands. Historically, in the heat of those initial assaults, many German soldiers who attempted to surrender were shot dead on the spot. This was not an official Allied policy. The official orders were to take prisoners for intelligence purposes, but in the adrenaline-fueled nightmare of the assault, the unwritten rule of the frontline took over. Many Allied soldiers simply refused to accept the surrender of men who had just massacred their friends seconds prior. Furthermore, taking a prisoner in the middle of a firefight is a massive tactical liability. If an American squad of 6 men captures 3 German soldiers, who guards them? They cannot spare 2 men to march the prisoners back to the beach. They need every rifle to assault the next trench. They cannot leave the prisoners behind them, out of fear that the Germans might pick up discarded weapons and shoot them in the back. The brutal calculus led to a dark reality on D-Day. In the initial waves, a no quarter mentality frequently prevailed. Surrendering Germans were often gunned down, bayoneted, or simply ignored as grenades were thrown into their trenches. The fear of fake surrenders also fueled this ruthlessness. There were isolated incidents where a group of German soldiers would raise their hands, only for a hidden machine gunner behind them to open fire on the exposed Allied troops who stood up to take them captive. Once word of these traps spread down the beach line, Allied soldiers became incredibly highly strung. Any sudden movement by a surrendering German could, and often did, result in a lethal volley of rifle fire. Adding to the tragedy of the surrender dynamic was a massive linguistic and cultural barrier. When we think of the men defending the Atlantic Wall, we picture hardened, ideologically driven German troops. But the reality of the 716th Infantry Division, which defended Omaha and Gold Beaches, was vastly different. A significant portion of these defenders were Osttruppen, Eastern troops. These were conscripts from the Soviet Union, Poland, and other Eastern territories who had been captured by the Wehrmacht and given a brutal choice: starve to death in a German prisoner of war camp, or put on a German uniform and man the coastal defenses in France. Many of these men had absolutely no loyalty to the Nazi regime. The moment the Allied bombardment began, their only goal was to surrender to the Americans and British as quickly as possible. But when they emerged from their bunkers with their hands raised, shouting, "Please don't shoot," in Russian, Polish, or Czech, the Allied soldiers had no idea what they were saying. To the terrified, adrenaline-pumped American and British troops, these men were wearing the field grey uniforms of the enemy. They were the ones who had been shooting at them all morning. Tragically, countless Osttruppen were executed by Allied troops while desperately trying to explain, in languages the Allies didn't understand, that they didn't want to fight. This miscommunication was absolute, and in the deafening roar of the beachfront, the universal sign of raised hands was often not enough to stop an Allied bullet. As the morning turned into afternoon, and the Allies finally secured a foothold on the bluffs, the intense, chaotic violence began to subside. The front line moved inland, and the logistical machinery of the Allied armies began to set up on the beaches. It was at this point that the treatment of German soldiers drastically shifted. Once the immediate threat of combat was removed, the Allies transitioned from lethal force to organized captivity. Surviving German soldiers were stripped of their weapons, helmets, and webgear. They were thoroughly searched for concealed weapons and intelligence documents. For the newly captured German POWs, being marched down to the shoreline was a moment of profound psychological shock. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them that the Allies were weak, disjointed, and incapable of mounting a true invasion. But as they were marched onto the sands of Normandy, the German prisoners were forced to look out at the English Channel. What they saw broke their morale completely. The horizon was entirely obstructed by thousands of Allied ships. The sky was black with Allied aircraft. The sheer, overwhelming industrial might of the Allied war machine was laid bare before them. Many German veterans later wrote that it was in that exact moment, standing on the beach as a prisoner, that they realized the war was truly lost. Despite the utter brutality of the morning, the aftermath showcased a remarkable return to military discipline and humanity. Allied medics, who just hours before had been dodging German bullets, were now actively treating wounded German soldiers. Triage centers were set up on the sand, and American and British doctors operated on German defenders side by side with their own men. The prisoners were then loaded onto the very same landing ship tanks, the LSTs, that had brought the Allied armies to France. They were shipped across the Channel to heavily guarded but well-supplied POW camps in England. For these men, the war was over. They had survived the inferno of the Atlantic Wall, and they would spend the rest of the conflict safely behind barbed wire, receiving regular meals and medical care from the nations they had tried to destroy. The story of D-Day is rightfully remembered as a triumph of courage, logistical genius, and the liberation of a continent. But war is never a sterile, clean endeavor. To break the Atlantic Wall, the Allies had to unleash a level of violence that is difficult for the modern minds to fully comprehend. They rained explosive steel from the sky, they burned men alive inside concrete tombs, and in the chaotic, blood-soaked moments of the initial assault, they frequently offered no quarter to those who tried to surrender. What Allies did to the German soldiers on D-Day was terrifying, ruthless, and mechanically efficient. It had to be. The survival of the free world depended on cracking that defensive line, no matter the cost in human suffering. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy were not unfeeling machines. They were ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary nightmare. And in order to survive that nightmare and secure the beachhead, they had to become just as lethal and just as unforgiving as the concrete fortresses they conquered. But while D-Day was the bloody turning point of the war in Europe, the story of how this global nightmare actually started is widely misunderstood. The narrative we've all been taught about the origins of World War II leaves out a massive, terrifying piece of the puzzle. To uncover the dark, true origins of the conflict, and what most historians get wrong, click the video on your screen right now.